still, calm summer's day in 1940. In the formal gardens of Versailles in Paris, a small group of French generals make their way towards a single isolated railway carriage. It was placed incongruously in the centre of these elegant gardens, which were laid out at the height of French power in Europe. This was Hitler's final thrust of the knife. In the same railway carriage, just 22 years earlier, the German commanders had been forced to sign the document that signalled their total defeat at the end of World War I. Now, in just a few brief, brutal weeks, he had smashed the French army, the largest standing army in Europe, into complete submission. Forcing the French generals to sign their surrender in that historic railway carriage was a masterstroke of humiliation. And with the signing, Hitler became sole master of Europe, from the Channel coast to the Urals. He had achieved an astounding triumph. And now for Britain. Even Churchill would sue for peace with the fall of France. And if not, the mighty German Air Force would smash Britain into submission in a matter of weeks. German bomber squadrons were now located in France and Holland. London itself was less than an hour's flying time away across the Channel. In 1940, Britain seemed virtually defenceless. Its army was in ruins after the shambles of the evacuation from Dunkirk. In fact, Britain's survival depended on three vital weapons. The first was about to be put through the toughest test in its history. It was the thin blue line of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command. In those dark days, Fighter Command consisted of a few dozen squadrons stretched around Britain's southern and eastern coasts. Many of them were barely up to strength, with pilots fresh out of flying school. With just a few hours' experience on the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, they were about to fly against the battle-hardened bomber fleets of the Luftwaffe, the biggest and most experienced air force in the world. The second weapon was known to the Germans, but they grossly underestimated its key role as a weapon of air defence. It was radar. The line of British radar stations had been developed not a moment too soon. They picked up the signals from the German bombers as they gathered over France, and gave the defending fighter squadrons just enough time to get airborne and in position to launch their counterattacks. But the third weapon was totally secret, unknown to the Germans, unknown even to all but a handful of men at the very top of the Allied High Command, the Codebreakers of Station X, an old Victorian mansion some 50 miles to the north of London. The Codebreakers were to play the most vital role in every aspect of the war about to break over Britain. The Codebreakers themselves were a group of men and women, largely academics, certainly some of the brightest and most intelligent people in the entire population of Britain, gathered together at Station X, or Bletchley Park to give it its real name. They had one overwhelming objective: to break the mystery of the Enigma codes. Bletchley Park was a quite extraordinary operation. It started off as a handful of academics. By the end of the war, it had grown to over 10,000 men and women from all walks of life, many we now know from the US services, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, listening, analysing, guessing, striving to squeeze the last drop of meaning out of the torrent of radio signals now generated by the huge German military machine occupying Europe. Even today, it boggles the imagination because these signals were wrapped in the most sophisticated cipher system yet invented. A modern supercomputer, for example, like a Cray, might work 24 hours a day and still take a year to crack a single Enigma message. So great was the number of cipher alphabets generated by this machine. But even that doesn't really represent the sheer scale of the task facing the Codebreakers of Bletchley Park. Just imagine for a moment the complexity and the spread of the German forces. The U-boat fleets, for example, were now based at Lorient on the French Biscay coast, under the command of Admiral Dönitz. Every U-boat, every naval office, every ship leaving harbour, had its own Enigma machine to enable it to transmit and receive orders and instructions. The same is true of every German airbase, from the French Atlantic coast, north to Norway, and east to the Russian border. Every Air Force base, every German army unit throughout Europe had its Enigma team, transmitting and receiving hundreds of messages all day, every day. Hundreds of signals on everything you can think of, from supplies of food and fuel and equipment, the movement and transfer of people, accidents, emergencies, all the rest of it, both serious and trivial. But any of it might provide the vital clue to a troop movement or a change of command or the beginnings of a major battle plan. All of it pouring out into the ether in a constant clatter of signals wrapped in the Enigma ciphers, going both to the intended German recipient and also across the channel to the eavesdroppers in Britain. Now, making sense of all that was the task facing the codebreakers of Bletchley Park. All German military radios had the words "Feind hören mit" stamped on them. It means the enemy is listening. Indeed they were. The British listening posts were never unmanned for a single hour during the entire war. The ceaseless tide of incoming signals was copied down with tireless accuracy, still wrapped in its code groups. Then they were telegraphed over secure landlines to the secret army of codebreakers at Bletchley Park. The codebreakers were housed in a village of simple wartime wooden huts that slowly spread out across the grounds of the house. In effect, the codebreakers had to duplicate the German signals organisation. Some worked on the naval Enigma, others on the army signals, and yet other groups on the German Air Force signals traffic. And as the task grew in scale, more and more brilliant young students were discreetly recruited from the universities. Sean Wiley was recruited by the brilliant mathematician Alan Turing.
I first knew him at Princeton when we were graduate students together, and I found him a dull man. It shows how stupid you could be. Then I got to know him quite well during the time at Bletchley. He was clearly an eccentric man. I found him a very amusing man. He had a great cackle of a laugh, and he would come up with absurd statements and absurd suggestions. And he was prickly, but amusing and, of course, highly imaginative.
Alan Turing was undoubtedly one of the most remarkable men ever involved in codebreaking. His greatest contribution, perhaps, was to design the proto-computer that played such a key role in breaking the Enigma codes. This machine was called, quite strangely, a bombe, B-O-M-B-E, after an earlier Polish design. It consisted basically of a stack of typical Enigma rotor wheels which could be set in a particular position and then spun rapidly to enable the codebreakers to locate the vital keys, which would enable them to read the flow of intercepted German signals in a matter of hours rather than days or weeks. The need for more of these machines became desperate, since they held the key to success, and quite soon Churchill made the decision to bring the Americans into Britain's most secret operation. Sean Wiley again.
When I first got to Bletchley, there was a great concern because there was going to be a visit, an official visit, from American soldiers, I think they were. I think Sinkoff and Kalbeck were to be two of them. And at that time, we had this gadget called the bombe, and the Americans weren't supposed to know about it. And Turing had to spent probably 2 weeks trying to make up stories about how we'd had the successes that we had had without the use of a bombe.
The American industrial machine churned out hundreds of these vital machines. What's more, the American machines were improved versions of the originals built in the UK, bigger and faster. They were operated in the greatest secrecy by servicewomen in special centres in Washington.
We were assigned to a building, 2 stories, and in the building, on each floor, were approximately 60 of these machines. And we were taught to run them. They gave us a graph to follow, and we would set these switches to certain numbers. And then came down here to set the rotor wheels And I realized these were the wheels we were putting together in Dayton, Ohio. So we would put the settings to the numbers. There was a little clip, and you would unclip it, pull the wheel out, and you would set it to the number, and then push it back in and clip it in place. When all the switches were set to the proper numbers and all the rotor wheels were set, we came over here and pushed the button. Then we sat on a stool at the end of the machine for the run, what we called the run. When the message was broken, all of these lights would flash, and then the machine would stop. And at that point, it would print. When it was finished printing and the machine started up again, we would tear it off and rush to the end of the room, knock on a door, and a hand would come out, and you would say, "Strike." The hand took the message away. You never saw it again. You couldn't read the message because it was in columns of letters. So apparently, when they took it away, it went somewhere to be decoded.
How long did that go on?
That went on for 2 years, and we kept these machines running night and day for 2 years.
Were there times when you were given, if you like, special emergency messages that had to be broken? Were you aware of that?
Oh, yes. They would come in and give you one and say, a graph, and say, "This is a rush," and you would immediately get to work and set everything. And after everything was set, we had to double check before we pushed the button.
Did you know what you were doing?
I hadn't really the faintest idea what I was doing, but as the time went by, you knew it had something to do with code breaking. So one day I said to my wave officer, "Could you tell me what's going on here? Do you have any idea?" And she said, "Well, I don't know a whole lot more than you do, but I can tell you, I heard someone say, we're breaking the back of the German U-boats." And I remember I thought, oh, wow.
Now, the American contribution to the Enigma code-breaking effort is not often described. In fact, it was huge. Eventually, Bletchley Park and Washington worked almost as a combined unit, sharing up-to-the-minute breakthroughs to increase the rate at which they could read the growing tide of German signals. And this partnership became crucial in cracking the most difficult codes of all, the U-boat signals. Now, from London's point of view, this partnership was not without its dangers, since Washington was capital of an open society with a ruthless investigative press. It was considered to be about as secure as a child's piggy bank. But London was wrong. In fact, this ultra-secret held right to the end of the war and beyond. David Kahn.
Once the United States came into the naval war, cooperation became extremely close between the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park and the American naval codebreakers at Nebraska Avenue in Washington. They were not actually hardwired together in that the machines, the bombs, the key finding aids were actually linked together, but the cooperation was extremely intimate in that when one found a key or a possible key, it was immediately reported to the other side of the Atlantic so both could recover the messages based on this key.
And steadily, the number of trained American codebreakers at Bletchley Park increased. Among the first was a young Army Lieutenant, Arthur Levinson.
I learned in the summer of 43, or in the spring of 43, that an agreement had been reached, as I say, at the highest levels between Churchill and Roosevelt to approve the sending of a team of Americans to assist the British in the German problem. And we were somewhat handpicked, so not to disgrace the Americans, and if we turned out to be duds, it would have been very awkward indeed. They'd say thanks a lot, but no thanks. And when we got to Bletchley, we were trained, some of us in the crypt part, by John Herrivel, and then distributed in various parts of the activity. Some were linguists, became translators. Some of us went into the crypt side, and some in the traffic analysis.
But you worked right alongside the British.
We worked right alongside the British. And we were, as I say, integrated as opposed to differentiated for any students of the calculus. And that was exactly the case. We were treated no differently. But we stayed in uniform, of course, which gave us a little glamour. There were so few of them there. And mostly they made great hits with the young ladies in Bletchley. And I was assigned to a room with Professor Dennis Babbage, a mathematician from Peterhouse, and Dr. Aitken, a classicist and Scottish chess champion. I couldn't understand either of them. Professor Babbage spoke in a very low voice in a very refined Cambridge accent, and Aitken spoke some Glaswegian. In any case, I found it very difficult, and they literally talked over my head. And the conversations were incomprehensible, but I remember Babbage coming, saying, "Would you check this for me, Arthur?" And that I understood.
In purely theoretical mathematical terms, the Enigma codes could not have been broken for perhaps 100 years, even more. But time and time again, the US and British codebreakers describe how this secret war was fought out on very human terms. They got to know, for example, the habits of particular German operators, although of course they never knew them by name. They saw very human foibles and mannerisms creeping in when the German operators were setting the all-important 6-letter keys that governed the machine for the next few hours. Against all the rules, they used, for example, girlfriends' names, or explicit sexual slang, or repetitive patterns of letters. These gave the codebreakers the all-important toehold.
It required getting familiar with the traffic in a way that just looking at the ciphertext, you had a feel for what this message was or what that message was. And that was the good part of assigning each key to an individual so that they could study it in great depth and understand the habits of the guys who were sending the messages. I mean, how fast they worked, and what their idiosyncrasies were, and how they chose their indicators. Some of them took their girlfriends' names, and you got to know who the girlfriends were. Some engaged in obscenities, which were helpful. Some were fans of American movie stars. And in one case, the outside indicator was Tom, and we thought maybe the inside, Tom Tom. But it turned out it was Tom Mix, who fortunately had a 6-letter name.
The most disciplined operators by far were the U-boat men, because their very lives depended on secrecy. But the German Air Force were the worst offenders. This scene of an Enigma, actually in operation, was shot on a home movie camera during the war by a German pilot. He and the men seen would have been shot if this film had been discovered by the Gestapo. It was filmed in flagrant disregard of the cloak of secrecy surrounding everything to do with Enigma operations. As a consequence of this kind of loose discipline in the German Air Force, the British and US codebreakers cracked the German Air Force Enigma very early in the war. But of course, that wasn't the end of the matter. The text of these intercepted messages was still in German, and military German at that. So there was also an army of translators at Bletchley Park, not often talked about. It was their job to turn the often obscure German forces slang and abbreviations into meaningful English, with no ambiguities, since men's lives were at risk if mistakes were made. Selma Nolan was a young graduate from Iowa who had just majored in German and been sent across the Atlantic to work at Bletchley Park in Hut 3.
Well, this was a 24-hour-a-day operation, 7 days a week, continuously from the time I arrived there until the war ended. what happened, we were entirely at the mercy, of course, of the cryptanalysts who each day, at the beginning of the German day, I've forgotten, perhaps midnight Berlin time or something of that sort, all of the cryptographic indicators would change, the keys, the settings, and so forth. And then the cryptanalysts would have to wait until they got enough traffic to be able to recover the keys for the day in a particular system, and each user had its own key system, so that we would be working, for example, if I were working on the midnight shift, we would come to work at midnight and start perhaps working on some of the lower priority traffic left over from the previous day until such time as the cryptanalysts were able to make the key recoveries for the day, in which case then new current day's traffic would start coming in, perhaps 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, something of that sort.
Throughout the long, hot summer of 1940, the German bomber fleets droned relentlessly across the Channel to pound their targets in Britain. The cities, the airfields, the factories. Goering had promised Hitler that his aerial armada, the most powerful air force the world had ever seen, could pound Britain into submission in 4 weeks. The 4 weeks came and went, and still day after day, week after week, the aerial bombardment continued. For the fighter pilots, it was a kind of living hell. Scramble, 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 make Angels 2-0, large bomber force approaching from the southwest. The pilots flew 3, 4, maybe 5 or more sorties a day, until they could scarcely stay awake at the controls. Newspapers were full of stories of brave young men in their flying machines and accounts of the huge numbers of enemy bombers that were being destroyed. But British pilots were being killed or disabled faster than they could be replaced. It was a battle of attrition, and the British resources, both men and machines, were fast being exhausted. At Fighter Command headquarters, in a bunker deep underground just north of London, the British controllers were playing a game of chess, with the fighter squadrons as their pieces, throwing a squadron into the battle here, withdrawing one from the line there. But these controllers were fighting a battle against overwhelming odds. And as it dragged on, through August into September, so the strain on the British fighter pilots reached breaking point. Could Fighter Command survive, let alone win this great battle? What tipped the scales in favour of the British defenders was undoubtedly the breaking of the Enigma codes. The Battle of Britain was perhaps the first really decisive use of Allied wartime code breaking. It profoundly changed the course of the battle. The brilliant use of radar could tell the controllers where the bombers were, but only the code breakers could tell them why, what the targets were, which were the really decisive raids that had to be confronted, which were simply feints or diversions. So on September the 15th, 1940, called Adlertag by the Luftwaffe, or Eagle Day, the British commanders as well as the Germans knew that this was it, the climax of the battle, the final throw of the dice. As the day passed its climax and drew to a close, it was clear that both sides had lost heavily in men and machines. But Fighter Command lived to fight on. The Battle of Britain was won.